Marcus Agrippa, the man who actually won Augustus's wars. In 38 BC, Octavian sat on a beach in southern Italy and watched what was left of his fleet wash ashore. Not the wreckage of a battle, the wreckage of a storm. 2 invasion fleets gone. Not to an enemy, not to strategy, not to anything a man could fight back against. Just the sea, the rocks, and the whirlpools the Strait of Messina was infamous for. His sailors were at the bottom of the water. His soldiers stood on the sand with nowhere to go. And somewhere across that water, on the island of Sicily, a man named Sextus Pompey was standing on his own shoreline watching the debris float past and laughing. Sextus had just declared himself the son of Neptune. The gods, it seemed, had already chosen their side. Octavian was 25 years old. He held the title of Caesar's heir. He ruled the western half of the Roman world on paper. And he had just failed, twice in a row, to dislodge a pirate king from an island 40 miles from the Italian coast. Here is what makes this moment historically strange. That young man on the beach would become Augustus. He would become the founder of the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful rulers in the history of the world. The man a month is named after. The man whose face appeared on every coin in circulation across the Mediterranean for 40 years. History would remember him as a military genius, a conqueror, the man who ended the Roman Republic and replaced it with something that would last 5 centuries. But he could not win a single battle on his own. Every war that made Augustus was won by someone else. One man, specifically. A man of obscure birth, with no famous ancestors and no political future of his own, who solved every crisis Octavian could not solve, invented weapons when existing weapons were not enough, built infrastructure when infrastructure did not exist, and then stood aside and watched his friend take the credit. He asked for almost nothing. He received almost nothing by the standards of the world he lived in. And without him, there is no Augustus. There is no Roman Empire. The history of the Western world bends in a completely different direction. His name was Marcus Agrippa, and this is the story history spent 2,000 years trying to bury. To understand what Agrippa was up against, you have to understand what the Roman world looked like in the decade after Julius Caesar's assassination. Forget the marble and the togas and the Senate speeches. The Rome of the 40s and 30s BC was a world on fire. Caesar had been dead for less than a year when his murderers realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They killed the man, thinking it would restore the Republic. What it actually did was release every general, every faction, every ambitious man with an army who had been waiting for permission to act. The permission arrived on March 15th, 44 BC, in the form of 23 knife wounds on the floor of the Senate. What followed was 15 years of civil war. Not one civil war, a series of them, overlapping, interlocking, each one resolving into the conditions that made the next one inevitable. Caesar's heirs fought Caesar's killers. Then Caesar's heirs fought each other. Rome's most powerful men formed alliances and broke them within the same year, married into families, and then went to war against those families, promised their soldiers land and money, and then scrambled to find the land and money they had promised. The legions were the real currency. Whoever controlled the most legions controlled the most territory, and whoever controlled the most territory could raise the money to pay the legions, and whoever paid the legions best was owed their loyalty until someone paid them more. Into this world walked Gaius Octavius, 19 years old, Caesar's adopted son by will, holding a name that meant everything and the actual power to back it up that meant almost nothing. He had no military record. no battle experience, no army of his own. What he had was audacity and intelligence, and one friend who had been studying alongside him in Apollonia when the news of Caesar's death arrived across the Adriatic. That friend was Marcus Agrippa. We do not know exactly where Agrippa came from. Ancient sources are vague and modern historians still argue. What we know is that he was not from Rome's aristocracy. No famous father, no family name that opened doors. In a society where birth determined almost everything, Agrippa was starting the race 50 meters behind. The only way forward was through someone else, and the someone he chose, or who chose him, was Octavian. The partnership they built in those early years was one of the most consequential in ancient history. And it worked because they each had exactly what the other lacked. Octavian brought the name, the legal claim, the political genius that could navigate Rome's treacherous factions without getting killed. Agrippa brought everything that actually won wars: the engineering intelligence, the tactical creativity, the ability to look at a problem no one had solved before and build the solution from scratch, and above all, the willingness to fight. While Octavian spent the 40s and early 30s BC playing politics, forming the triumvirate with Mark Antony and Lepidus, maneuvering through assassination plots, buying loyalty and occasionally selling it, Agrippa was fighting. He suppressed a revolt in Gaul. He conducted campaigns in Germany that won him a triumph, which he reportedly declined because Octavian had not yet earned one. He was already, in those years, the better general. He was already the indispensable one. He was just not the one anyone was watching. That changed in 38 BC on a beach in southern Italy when the options ran out. Here is what the Sextus Pompey problem actually meant in practical terms. Sicily is an island. It sits at the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, 40 miles from Italy at the closest point, controlling the sea lanes that connected Rome to the grain-producing provinces of North Africa and the East. Without those grain ships, Rome starved. Not metaphorically, literally. The city's population depended on imported grain, and Sextus Pompey controlled the water it had to cross. He was not simply an enemy. He was a hand around Rome's throat. He could squeeze or release at will, and when he squeezed, people in Rome went hungry and Octavian looked impotent, and the political foundation under Octavian's feet began to crack. Octavian had tried to break the stranglehold twice. Both times, the Mediterranean itself seemed to intervene on Sextus's behalf. The first attempt went poorly from the start. His ships outmaneuvered and outfought by Sextus's experienced sailors in the treacherous currents of the strait. The second attempt ended in catastrophe when a massive storm caught his fleet against the Sicilian coast, the same coast where Sextus's ships were safely tucked in harbor, and dashed them on the rocks. Men drowned in the dark. Ships that had taken months to build were matchwood by morning. By the time the sun rose and the water calmed, most of Octavian's fleet and a large portion of his sailors were gone. Sextus Pompey stood on the shore and proclaimed himself the son of Neptune. The proclamation was not entirely absurd. The sea had destroyed his enemy twice. What else would you call that? Octavian made two decisions after the second disaster. The first was to recall Agrippa from Gaul. The second was to give him the consulship, the highest civilian office in Rome, at an age so far below the legal minimum that it was effectively a declaration of emergency. The message was clear. Normal rules were suspended. The situation was too serious for anything except results. Everything now rested on one man. Agrippa looked at the problem the way he looked at all problems, not from the question of how to win the next battle, but from the question of why the previous battles had been lost. The answer was structural. There was no harbor on the west coast of Italy large enough and secure enough to house, train, and stage the scale of fleet that would be needed. There was nowhere to build ships in secret, nowhere to drill sailors without Sextus's scouts reporting it, nowhere to concentrate an invasion force without giving the enemy months to prepare a response. You could not win this war without first solving an infrastructure problem. And no one had bothered to solve it, because no one before had understood it clearly enough to state it. Agrippa stated it, and then he solved it. He found two coastal lakes south of Cumae, Lake Avernus and Lake Lucrinus, separated from the open sea by a narrow strip of land. He dug canals, one connecting the two lakes, one connecting the outer lake to the sea. He built a harbor inside the combined water, hidden from coastal observation, large enough for an entire fleet to maneuver in, protected from the winter storms that had destroyed the previous two attempts. He connected it by tunnel to the city of Cumae so that supplies could flow in and out without appearing on the coast at all. The work took nearly a year, thousands of laborers, enormous logistical coordination, all of it executed without Sextus Pompey learning what was happening 20 miles from open water. He called it the Portus Julius. Its ruins still exist underwater off the coast of modern Pozzuoli. You can dive to them. The engineering is still recognizable 2,000 years later. But Agrippa was not only building a harbor. He was solving the problem one level deeper. His fleet would be heavier than Sextus's, slower and harder to maneuver, because the advantage of heavier ships was height. His archers and javelin men, positioned in towers on the upper decks, would have elevation over any enemy vessel that came alongside. More importantly, he was designing his entire tactical approach around what his men were actually better at. Roman legionaries were the finest close combat infantry in the ancient world. Sextus's sailors were experienced. His legionaries were superior. If Agrippa could get soldiers onto enemy decks, the battle became a land fight on water, and in land fights, his men won. The existing Roman boarding technology, a hinged bridge called the corvus, required getting close enough that an experienced enemy crew could simply maneuver away. Agrippa needed something that denied that option. He designed the harpax, a large iron grappling hook fitted with a long iron sleeve near the tip to prevent it from being cut free, fired from a ballista mounted on the deck. Once it caught in an enemy ship's hull or rigging, a mechanical winch began drawing the two vessels together. You could try to back-paddle against it. That only exhausted your oarsmen. You could try to cut the rope. The iron sleeve stopped your blade. The ship was coming to you, and when it arrived, your crew was fighting men who had been trained for exactly this. He trained his crews on the new weapon for months in the hidden harbor. He ran drills. He identified problems and corrected them. By the time the fleet left the Portus Julius, it had not merely been built, it had been prepared. The invasion of Sicily launched in the spring of 36 BC. Three forces, three angles: Lepidus from Africa in the south, Octavian and Agrippa from the north. A storm destroyed much of the supply train before the campaign had fairly started and forced a retreat to Italy for repairs. When they came back, the fighting was immediate and uneven in ways that would define the entire year. Agrippa moved first and moved hard. He took roughly 100 ships to the northern Sicilian harbor of Mylae, where intelligence indicated a Pompeian squadron was stationed. What he found when he arrived was worse than expected. Sextus himself had received warning and was converging on the same point with an additional 115 ships. Agrippa was now facing the majority of the Pompeian fleet with his vanguard. He did not retreat. He sent a rider back for his reserve ships and drew up for battle. What followed at Mylae established the tactical template for everything that came after. The Pompeian ships came in the way they always came in, using their superior speed and maneuverability to circle and isolate, to sweep oars, to pick off individual vessels before the others could respond. Agrippa let them come. His heavier ships, lower in speed but taller in profile, showered the attacking vessels with arrows and javelins from the elevated towers as soon as they came within range. Ships that came alongside were grappled and boarded. Agrippa himself found the Pompeian fleet commander's ship, rammed it hard enough to split the hull, and drove the man to transfer to another vessel. Sextus, watching from the shoreline, saw his fleet losing and ordered a withdrawal. Agrippa had destroyed 30 Pompeian ships. He had lost 5. It was the first time Octavian's forces had won a significant naval engagement in the entire war. It would not be the last. While Agrippa won in the north, Octavian moved to exploit the success by opening a front on the eastern coast of Sicily. He took 3 legions and roughly 150 ships and landed near Tauromenium. The plan was sound. The execution was a catastrophe. Sextus was not broken, not by a long distance, and he was a better commander than Octavian gave him credit for. Leaving decoy ships in the harbor at Mylae to make it appear his fleet was still in port, he sailed in darkness with the bulk of his remaining force and closed on Octavian's position from the sea while his army advanced along the coast. Octavian's men, in the middle of fortifying their camp, found themselves surrounded. Pompeian ships on the water, Pompeian soldiers on the land. Supply line to Italy severed. Octavian was trapped on a Sicilian beach with no fleet and no way out. The contrast with his subordinate was not subtle. At the same moment, Octavian was being besieged by the enemy he had come to destroy. Agrippa was operating freely in the north, landing forces, taking positions, applying steady pressure. It was Agrippa's continued presence and threat that prevented Sextus from concentrating everything on finishing Octavian off. Agrippa kept him divided. He kept him uncertain. He bought time with constant aggressive action while Octavian's trapped force held on. But the real test was still coming. And when it came, it would not be a test of courage or tactics alone. It would be a test of whether one man's mind could stay one move ahead of an enemy who was learning fast. By late summer of 36 BC, the political situation had added a second pressure. Lepidus, who had successfully landed in Sicily and taken several towns in the south, was making moves to claim the island for himself. If Lepidus emerged from this campaign as the dominant figure, if he could present himself as the man who had won Sicily while Octavian was getting rescued, the balance of the triumvirate would shift in ways that could end Octavian's position permanently. A decisive naval victory was not just militarily necessary. It was the only thing that could preserve Octavian's political future, and it was needed immediately. Sextus understood the same calculus from the other direction. He knew that time was working against him now. His supply of willing allies was limited. His fleet, though still formidable, had taken losses at Mylae it could not easily replace. If he waited, the pressure would only increase. He had to fight. The two fleets met off the Cape of Naulochus, approximately 300 ships per side. Sextus had learned from Mylae. He had enlarged his vessels to match the height advantage that had beaten his previous squadron. He had studied what he could learn of Agrippa's tactics and prepared responses. He was an intelligent, experienced commander doing everything right. He had not seen the harpax. When the battle began and the Pompeian ships came in on their traditional attack approach, the grappling hooks fired. The iron-sheathed lines caught in hull and rigging. The winches turned, and Sextus's ships, faster and more maneuverable than anything Agrippa had in his fleet, discovered that speed meant nothing when you were being dragged backward against your will toward several hundred armored Romans who had been training for this moment for 8 months. Some crews tried backpaddling. The iron sheathing held the ropes against their blades. Backpaddling only exhausted the oarsmen and made the ships sluggish. Ship after ship was caught, reeled in, and turned into a deck fight. From both shores, the armies of both sides stood watching the chaos on the water, unable to distinguish friend from enemy in the smoke and noise, shouting encouragement into a void. The outcome was not a battle, it was an erasure. Ancient accounts claim only one Pompeian ship escaped. Even if that number is exaggerated, the scale of the destruction was decisive. Sextus Pompey fled east, toward the court of Mark Antony, where he would later be killed by men who no longer needed him. The fleet that had strangled Italy's grain supply for years and humiliated Octavian twice was gone. It had been built by Agrippa. It had been trained by Agrippa. It had been defeated by a weapon Agrippa invented, because the weapons that existed were not good enough. In the political aftermath, Octavian walked into Lepidus's camp and stripped him of command through sheer audacity, appealing directly to the soldiers over their general's head and offering amnesty to anyone who switched sides. Lepidus was exiled rather than executed. The triumvirate was effectively over. Octavian was the uncontested master of the Western Roman world, with all the resources, all the legions, all the political machinery that implied. The reason he had that platform was standing somewhere in the background and not asking for much in return. The final confrontation with Mark Antony had been coming for years. Everyone knew it. The triumvirate had always been a truce among rivals, a temporary arrangement to avoid a war each man knew was eventually inevitable. Now that Lepidus was gone, the question of who would rule Rome resolved to two names, and the two men had been moving toward each other like tectonic plates shifting for a decade. Do not underestimate what Antony was. This is important, because if you think of him only as the man who lost, you miss why Agrippa's achievement was extraordinary. Mark Antony was the finest Roman general of his generation after Julius Caesar himself. He had fought at Philippi and destroyed Caesar's assassins. He had commanded legions for 20 years. He understood logistics, strategy, terrain, and the psychology of soldiers in ways that Octavian would never match. He had the wealth of Egypt behind him, administered by Cleopatra, who was arguably the shrewdest political mind in the Eastern Mediterranean. He had 500 warships and roughly 100,000 soldiers drawn from the veteran legions of the East and the armies of allied kings across the region. His military resources were, by any objective measure, superior to Octavian's, and none of it mattered. Because Agrippa understood something about Antony that Antony had never bothered to understand about Agrippa. By 32 BC, the political break was complete. Antony had divorced Octavian's sister, a calculated insult that crossed every line available. In a ceremony in Alexandria, he had distributed Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Octavian obtained Antony's will, illegally, from the Vestal virgins who held it, and had its contents read aloud in the Senate, where it confirmed that Antony intended the East as a separate realm under his heirs. Octavian declared war, carefully, not on Antony, which would have been civil war, but on Cleopatra, which was foreign war. The legal distinction was thin. The political effect was decisive. He had framed the entire conflict as Rome defending itself against an Eastern queen who had seduced its greatest general. It was brilliant propaganda and mostly false and completely effective. Both sides spent the winter of 32 to 31 BC gathering their forces. Antony chose Actium as his base of operations, a position on the western coast of Greece overlooking the Gulf of Ambracia, a long, narrow bay that gave his fleet excellent protection and gave his army a fortified camp on high ground. From there, the plan was an invasion of Italy. He had the ships to cross the Adriatic. the soldiers to fight the campaign, and in theory, the momentum to strike before Octavian could fully consolidate. Agrippa saw where the plan was vulnerable before Antony had finished putting it together. A force of 100,000 men does not run on courage. It runs on grain and water and money and timber and rope and bronze and 1,000 other commodities that have to travel from somewhere to reach the men who need them. Antony's supply chain ran from Egypt and the eastern provinces westward along the Greek coast and through a series of ports and supply depots. The most critical of these was a city on the southern tip of the Peloponnese called Methone. It was the last major hub before the supplies had to cross open water toward Actium. Cut it, and the entire chain from Egypt to Antony's army was effectively severed. In the early months of 31 BC, while Antony and Cleopatra were still consolidating their forces and Antony's enormous army was still assembling from its winter quarters across the eastern Mediterranean, Agrippa struck. He selected an elite force, approximately 50 ships and 5,000 heavy infantry. He sailed in darkness, the preferred timing for an assault on a fortified position, to maximize surprise and minimize the time defenders had to organize a coherent response before the landing force was already inside the walls. The garrison commander, King Bogud of Mauritania, one of Antony's experienced and trusted allies, was killed in the fighting. The city fell. The ancient sources say almost nothing about this operation. One sentence, maybe two, in passing. Barry Strauss, one of the leading modern historians of the period, has called it one of the most daring and consequential military actions in Roman history. The silence in the ancient record is not because the event was minor. It is because acknowledging it fully would have required acknowledging who designed and executed the entire campaign that followed. We will return to why that silence was carefully maintained. Using Methone as a forward base, Agrippa began a campaign of systematic interdiction along Antony's entire supply chain. He was not trying to destroy Antony's fleet in open battle. Not yet. His goal was to cut every artery, block every port, force Antony to forage locally for supplies he should have been receiving from Egypt, and in doing so trap the enormous army at Actium, where it would slowly consume itself. He took Lucus in a further naval engagement. He struck at Patrae. He won 2 more engagements that, combined with Methone, effectively put Antony's fleet inside the Gulf of Ambracia with no reliable way out and no reliable way to feed the army on shore. Octavian crossed the Adriatic safely with his own forces. Agrippa had cleared the way. The two armies faced each other across the narrow neck of land north of the Gulf. Neither moved. And now time became the weapon. Antony's position, which had looked so formidable through the winter, began to crack. With his supply chain cut and his foraging capacity limited by the geography of the Gulf, his army began eating through reserves. The marshes around Actium, beautiful country in autumn and winter, became malarial in spring and summer. Soldiers began dying of fever. Then they began doing something worse than dying. They began leaving. A senator crossed to Octavian's lines. Then another. 2 allied kings, Rumetalces and Deiotarus, took their auxiliary forces and switched sides, bringing their intelligence of Antony's position with them. Agrippa won another skirmish at Patrae and tightened the blockade. Octavian had agents operating inside Antony's camp, negotiating, promising, bribing. The army that had been assembled to invade Italy was being dissolved from within by the same logic that had always governed Roman civil wars. Men followed the man who was winning, and winning was starting to look like it had a name. And that name was increasingly not Antony. Then came the blow Antony could not recover from. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, the most experienced Roman admiral alive. a man who had spent decades fighting in the Adriatic and the Ionian, a man whose knowledge of these waters was deeper than anyone else in either fleet, crossed to Octavian's lines. He was dying of fever. He would not survive the crossing, he knew that. He went anyway. His defection said something that no amount of propaganda could unsay. The man who understood naval war in this region better than anyone on Earth had looked at the situation, weighed it, and chosen the other side. Antony executed suspected traitors and imposed harsh discipline. He ordered his new admiral to attempt a naval breakout and force a decisive engagement that might change the momentum. Agrippa drove it back. He tried to hire Macedonian mercenaries to replace his losses. The man he sent defected. Every move was blocked. Every option was narrowing. In the final weeks before battle, a senior officer named Quintus Dellius crossed to Octavian's side carrying Antony and Cleopatra's battle plans. Antony knew his plans had been betrayed. He was forced to revise them under time pressure, in a demoralized camp, coordinating with commanders whose confidence in each other had been eroded by months of failure and defection. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, Antony's fleet performed an action that told the whole story of where he stood. He burned his own ships, not all of them, the ones he could not adequately man. He concentrated what remained, roughly 230 vessels, loaded the treasury aboard, and did something else unusual. He loaded the sails. Combat ships do not bring sails to a battle. Sails are heavy. They take up space needed for fighting men. You bring sails when you are planning to sail somewhere after the battle is over, not when you are planning to stay and fight. Antony was not planning to win the battle at Actium. He was planning to break through the blockade with as much of his treasury and as many of his ships as possible, reach open water, and continue the war from somewhere he could actually maneuver. Egypt, the East, wherever he could find ground. Actium was not a battle he chose. It was the last exit from a trap that had been 6 months in the building. And the man who had built it was standing on the right flank of the opposing fleet waiting for him. The morning was gray. There was no wind. For 6 hours, neither fleet moved. Think about what that silence meant. 400 ships facing each other across open water, drums carrying across the surface, the calls of officers, the creak of rigging, 40,000 men on Antony's ships, more on Octavian's, all of them waiting. 6 hours of waiting, while the sun moved and the heat built and the oarsmen sat with their oars raised and the rowers' muscles began to tighten and the water stayed flat and still and the world held its breath. The pressure of that silence fell almost entirely on Antony. His crews were already worn from months of poor food and disease and the psychological weight of watching their numbers dwindle. Every hour of waiting was an hour of fuel burned, of morale declining, of the small doubts that live in the chest of every soldier getting slightly larger. Octavian and Agrippa could wait indefinitely. Antony could not. Around midday, a westerly breeze came up. Antony's fleet moved. Octavian on the left, Agrippa on the right. That positioning had not been chosen for ceremony. Octavian knew what he was good at, and he knew what he was not good at. And commanding a naval battle was not among his gifts. The right wing, the traditional place of command, the place where the battle would actually be decided, belonged to Agrippa. As Antony's line advanced, Agrippa bent his flanks forward, shaping his formation into a crescent that threatened to curl around both ends of the enemy line and envelop it. To prevent the envelopment, Antony ordered his left flank under the Admiral Sosius to attack and pin Octavian's position, while he extended his own right flank northward to match Agrippa's curling move. The center, stretched to support both flanks simultaneously, began to thin. Octavian's ships on the left did not meet Sosius head-on. They backed away. Slowly, steadily, drawing Sosius further from the main line, further from coordination with the center, while the westerly wind built against him and his oarsmen pulled harder and harder against the current and their own exhaustion. The gap between Sosius and the center of Antony's line widened. The line was losing coherence. Then the battle began in full across every point of contact simultaneously. Catapults fired, ballistae fired, arrows and javelins and slingstones crossed in both directions through air that was now thick with smoke and noise. Ships rammed, wood splitting against wood, with sounds that carried across the water like cannon fire. Where two ships locked together, they became their own world. Men fighting on decks 6 feet wide with swords and shields and boarding axes. Each vessel commandeered brutal engagement, while lighter ships darted through the chaos looking for gaps and vulnerable targets. For hours, the battle ground on without a clear advantage emerging, the fighting too close and too chaotic for anyone on shore to read the outcome. And then Cleopatra moved. Her 60 Egyptian ships had been held in the second line throughout the morning, throughout the 6 hours of waiting, throughout the full opening phase of the battle. They were loaded with the treasury. They had not fired a single weapon. And then, with both fleets fully committed across the entire line of battle, with no concentration of force available to intercept her, she drove her squadron forward, threaded through a gap in Agrippa's line, and made for open water to the south. The treasury went with her. Antony, on the right flank, saw it happen. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship. He followed. His fleet fought on for a while. Some captains may not have known immediately. Others kept fighting out of pride or stubbornness or the inertia of a battle already joined. But without leadership, without a plan, without any possibility of coordination, the resistance dissolved. 2/3 of Antony's remaining fleet was captured or destroyed. The army on shore, watching from the hills, sent emissaries to Octavian's camp. Their general was gone. Their cause was gone. They had been the most formidable military force assembled in the Roman world in a generation. They surrendered without a fight. The civil wars were over. The Republic was over. The empire had begun, though no one would call it that yet. And the man who had made it all possible was on the right wing watching the last of Antony's ships burn. Antony fled to Egypt. He tried to rally. The legions he had stationed in North Africa defected. He returned to Alexandria and waited for the end he could not prevent. A false report reached him that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his own sword and failed to die immediately, and spent his last hours being carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra was hiding, expiring in her arms with the news that she was still alive, that he had killed himself for nothing. Cleopatra, with Octavian's triumph in Rome now certain, and her own role in that triumph perfectly clear to her, took her own life. The manner is disputed. The outcome was not. Egypt fell to Octavian intact. The wealthiest territory in the Mediterranean, the granary that fed the ancient world, the treasury Cleopatra had spent decades accumulating, all of it passed to the man who had stood helpless on a beach in southern Italy 6 years before, staring at the ruin of his future. He used it to pay 60,000 disbanded soldiers. He used it to restore the grain supply to Italy. He used it to cement his political position so completely that it would never meaningfully be challenged again. He gave Agrippa the corona navalis, the naval crown. It was the highest military honor available for a naval commander, and it was given with full ceremony and genuine feeling. It was also, carefully and deliberately, a military honor rather than a political one. It acknowledged what could not be denied. It kept the broader credit where it needed to be. Agrippa accepted it. He wore it. He went back to work. What followed in the years after Actium is worth understanding because it changes how you read everything that came before it. Agrippa did not retire. He did not seek his reward in land or title or the political offices that his service had more than earned. He became the instrument through which Augustus, as Octavian was now known, built the physical world of the empire he was creating. He overhauled Rome's entire water infrastructure, extending the aqueducts, cleaning the sewers, repairing the system that had been neglected through decades of civil war. He paid for it from his own fortune. He built the original Pantheon. He built the baths of Agrippa and opened them to citizens without charge. He was serving as aedile, a relatively junior magistracy, while simultaneously being the second most powerful man in the Roman world, because the office suited the work, and the work was what mattered to him, and titles were less interesting to Marcus Agrippa than outcomes. He was also, and this requires careful thought, still solving Augustus's problems. Because the problem that could not be solved by aqueducts was the succession. Augustus had no son. He had a daughter, Julia. He needed Julia married to someone whose loyalty was total, whose competence was proven, whose political reliability was beyond any question, and who would bind his own considerable interests to the continuation of the dynasty. He looked at the options available to him in the entire Roman world. He arrived at the only candidate who actually qualified. He gave his daughter to Agrippa. Think about what this meant. A man of uncertain provincial origin, born without ancestors worth mentioning, who had spent his entire adult life as someone else's instrument, was now the son-in-law of the ruler of the known world. Their children, Gaius and Lucius and Agrippina and the others, became Augustus's adopted heirs. The bloodline of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the family that would rule Rome for the better part of a century, ran through Marcus Agrippa. Whatever name history attached to the imperial house, the genetic inheritance of Augustus's successors came from the man Rome's aristocracy would never have elected to office on his own. He died in 12 BC, somewhere around 50 years old, worn through by decades of work that had never stopped. Augustus was reportedly devastated. The ancient sources are careful about how much they reveal. But between the lines, it is clear that what Augustus lost was not just a general or an administrator. He lost the person who had made everything else possible. Follow the logic all the way back and sit with it. Without Agrippa, the Portus Julius does not exist. Without the Portus Julius, the fleet that defeated Sextus Pompey is never built. Without the fleet, the Sicily campaign fails a third time, and Octavian's political position collapses under the weight of his own military incompetence. Italy continues to starve. Octavian's coalition fractures. Sextus Pompey becomes a permanent power in the Western Mediterranean. The triumvirate does not resolve to a clean confrontation between two men. It remains a three-way stalemate with a pirate king holding the swing vote. Even if you give Octavian the survival of his political position and get to 36 BC without Agrippa, the Antony problem is unsolvable without him. A direct naval confrontation with Antony's 500-ship fleet, commanded by men who had spent their careers fighting in the Adriatic and the Aegean, without the attrition campaign that destroyed Antony's supplies and morale before a single ship met in battle at Actium, is a battle Octavian loses. The treasury of Egypt stays with Antony and Cleopatra. The legions of the East remain loyal to the man who pays them. The Roman world becomes two worlds, a Western empire centered on Rome and an Eastern realm centered on Alexandria, Antony as its general and Cleopatra as its queen. And the history of the Mediterranean takes a path that no one alive in 31 BC could have predicted. The world that actually happened, the world Augustus built, and the civilization that grew from it. The law and language and architecture and political inheritance that shaped everything from medieval Europe to the American Republic. That world existed because one man solved the problems that would have ended it before it began. He did not write memoirs. He gave no speeches that were preserved. He left no philosophy, no poetry, no account of his own campaigns. Ancient historians working in the Augustan tradition minimized his contributions methodically, because Augustus understood that history is a political instrument, and an empire cannot have two sons. The attack on Methone, the operation that broke Antony's supply chain and decided the outcome of Actium 6 months before the battle, gets one sentence in the surviving sources. The Portus Julius is a footnote. The Harpax is mentioned in passing. The crescent formation, the backpaddle strategy, the 6 months of methodical strangulation that reduced Antony's 100,000 men to a diseased and demoralized force willing to surrender without a fight. All of it filtered through a narrative in which Augustus is the protagonist and Agrippa is the useful instrument. This was not an accident. It was policy. And the most remarkable thing about Marcus Agrippa is that he appears to have accepted it. Not because he was diminished, not because he lacked the ability to demand recognition, but because he understood the system he had helped build and what it required to survive. You could not have two sons. The Republic had been destroyed by men competing for that position. The empire would last only if there was one source of legitimacy, one name, one story. Agrippa chose to be the gravity rather than the light. Whether that cost him something, we cannot know. He left no record of the price. What he left instead was the thing itself, the empire. The aqueducts still standing, the Pantheon rebuilt and standing still, the bloodline, the peace that followed 40 years of civil war, bought with the battles he fought, and the weapons he invented, and the harbors he built, and the supply lines he severed, and the fleets he destroyed. Augustus built Rome's mythology. He understood mythology and what it required, and he was extraordinary at it. But the foundation beneath the mythology, the actual load-bearing structure that kept the whole weight from collapsing, was a man named Marcus Agrippa, from somewhere in the provinces, origin uncertain, ancestors unknown, who built everything he had from nothing but intelligence and work, and one friendship he chose well and kept. History gave Augustus the throne. Every war that paid for it was won by someone else. The name on the coins is Augustus. The man who earned them was Agrippa. Now you know the difference.